the Texas School Book Depository Building, Dallas. From this sixth-floor window, Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly fired the shots that killed the President of the United States on November the 22nd, 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald, a figure of mystery, murdered before he could reveal what he knew. While the truth about him remains obscure, the myths abound.
He was average Joe, that was all.
He was behaving like someone who was belligerent and not showing any remorse for anything he had done.
You were not.
Lee Harvey Oswald is a question mark to history. The debate is often raised, was Lee Harvey Oswald alone as the assassin, or was he part of a conspiracy? The question is never raised, is it possible that he didn't do it at all?
6 weeks before the assassination, Oswald had taken a low-paid job as an order filler at the School Book Depository in downtown Dallas. Because of his impoverished circumstances, Oswald was living in the modest residential district of Oak Cliff, 4 miles out of town. Although married with 2 young daughters, weeknights were spent alone at this seedy rooming house at 1026 North Beckley, where Oswald had mysteriously registered under the name of O.H. Lee. Most weekends, however, he visited his Russian-born wife Marina and their baby daughters, who lived on the far side of town in the Irving district of Dallas. Unable to drive, he would hitch a lift with a fellow worker to this house, where his family lodged with the woman who had befriended them, a Quaker called Ruth Payne.
The idea of his having shot the president skews what everyone thinks, it seems to me, and we forget how ordinary he was, or how he would play with his children and with mine at the house on weekends. And my main memory of him is of his watching the football games on Saturday and Sunday, and he enjoyed watching the games on the TV set. He seemed concerned about his little girls, very much so.
Oswald loved being the family man. The colleague who drove him out to see them at weekends and lived only a few doors away witnessed that affection firsthand. Buell Wesley Frazier.
He liked children very much. That's one of the things that I could get Lee to talk about. When Lee came home with me on Friday afternoon and rode back with me on Monday morning, I never saw him or did anything with him at that time, but evidently the children in the neighborhood, all of them at one time or other, seemed to find their way up to the Payne house where Lee lived to play with him and his daughter. On November the 21st, I was working at the Texas School Book Depository. Oswald came up to me and he asked if he could ride home with me, and I said, sure. And then a little bit later, I realized it wasn't Friday. And the next time I saw him, I said, well, today's not Friday, Lee. And he says, I know that. He says, it's Thursday. He says, Marina has made some curtains for me, and they have some curtain rods out there. And he says, I'm going to get the curtain rods to put the curtains up in my apartment. I said, okay.
He had never come out without asking permission before, besides the fact that it was a weeknight. And he arrived, actually, I was out of the house when he arrived. I was grocery shopping. We bought a lot of groceries. And then he was there already playing with his children on the front lawn when I arrived about 5:30. As we went by each other, I said, very, very, very happy in Russian, our president is coming. And he just sort of brushed on by without saying anything or no really reaction, and in a way that was typical of him, so I gave it very little thought. He often didn't respond very much, but I think that evening he was especially quiet at dinner, and he went to bed very early.
On the morning of the assassination, Oswald overslept. Leaving money and his wedding ring behind, he hurried down the street to secure his ride to work with Frazier. Under his arm, he carried a brown paper package. Did this contain the gun that killed the President of the United States?
The first time I saw the package, it was on the back seat of my car, and I just glanced at it. And I asked, I said, what's that, Lee? And he said, that's curtain rods. He said, remember I was going to bring them? The length of the package that I saw that morning was roughly 2 foot long, give or take an inch or two. And it was made out of the same type of packing material that you would find in any company that packed materials for shipment. It's just the brown paper and the tape that you'd normally find. Nothing unusual. What we actually talked about that morning was that I said, President Kennedy is going to be coming to town today, and I said, you know, I've never seen a president I said, I sure would like to get a chance to see him up close. Well, at that time, I didn't know that the motorcade in which he would be riding would come right by where we worked. He did not make any comment at all about where the president was coming to town. It didn't seem to interest him one way or the other. I parked in the parking lot at Texas School Book Depository. Lee got out of the car, took the package that he said contained curtain rods, and he put one end of the package in the cup of his hand and the other up under his armpit. He put the package under his arm that way, and he walked off toward Texas School Book Depository up on Elm Street.
The package could not have contained Oswald's rifle, for even when dismantled, it was 3 feet long. The Warren commissioners, who investigated the assassination, ignored Frazier's unswerving testimony, insisting the weapon had been smuggled into the depository in Oswald's brown paper parcel. Harold Norman, another of Oswald's co-workers, also found nothing unusual in his behavior that morning.
I saw Oswald about 30 minutes, I'd say, before the motorcade was supposed to be coming through. And the reason why I remember seeing him is because he's an order filler, and I'm a checker. So I have to check the orders and make sure that they go out correctly to where they're supposed to go. But meantime, after I seen him on the first floor, I didn't see him anymore.
As far as eyewitnesses go, there was a woman named Carolyn Arnold who spoke to Oswald on the second floor moments before the shooting. Now, the motorcade was running 6 minutes late. Oswald, had he been up there, would have had no way of knowing this. He would have been up there on the 6th floor. He would have been waiting for at least 10 or 15 minutes in that so-called sniper's perch to shoot at President Kennedy as he either came toward the depository or as he went toward the triple underpass. One way or the other, he would have had to be up there at that time. He wouldn't be in the lunchroom on the 2nd floor.
Now they're waving, and here comes Jackie waving by. And Mr. Kennedy. President's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people running up the hill alongside Elm Street. Stand by just a moment, please. Put me on, Phil. Put me on. The motorcade is coming by here. The presidential car coming up now. We know it's the presidential car. You can see Mrs. Kennedy's pink suit. There's a Secret Service man, spread eagle, over the top of the car. We understand Governor and Mrs. Connolly are in the car with President and Mrs. Kennedy. We can't see who has been hit, if anybody's been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong. I'm in behind the motorcade, trying to follow them. It looks as though they're going to Parkland Hospital. And just now we've received reports here at Parkland that Governor Connolly was shot in the upper left chest, and the first unconfirmed reports say the president was hit in the head. That's an unconfirmed report that the president was hit in the head.
A priest has been ordered. Emergency supplies of blood also being rushed to the hospital.
Just a moment. We have a bulletin coming in. We now switch you directly to Parkland Hospital and KBOX News Director Bill Hampton.
The President of the United States is dead. It's official. As of just a few moments ago, the President of the United States is dead.
What I remember is being told that it was an oral report rather than a visual one, that the president had been shot. And then it was really quite a while later that we heard that he had died. And when I first heard that he'd been shot, I went and got a little votive candle and lit that. And Marina said, "Is that a way of praying?" And I said, "Yes, it's just sort of my way." We were both just very distressed, and let lunch sit on the table, neither interested in eating. As we followed the coverage, a little later on, life went on. We had children to take care of, and she was hanging out some laundry in the back line when I heard on the TV that the shots were thought to have been fired from the School Book Depository building.
Now riding the back trails of Texas, a former Dallas motorcycle officer recalls a remarkable encounter he had within 90 seconds of the assassination. The first policeman into the depository was Marion Baker.
I worked for the Dallas Police Department as a motorcycle officer and signed the motorcade that day. I was approximately 5 or 6 cars back from the lead car of the motorcade. I had gotten about halfway between Maine and Houston when I heard these 3 shots. And immediately I knew they was in front of me and high. And as I looked up, I saw this huge flock of pigeons flying from the top of this building. I rode my motorcycle over to the corner of the intersection, parked it, and then ran in the building, which took me a very few seconds to do this. When I got through the front doors into the lobby of the building, I asked where the elevators or the stairs would be. And one man spoke up, said, "I'm Mr. Truly, I'm the building manager." And he said, "Come on, officer, I'll show you." So he and I continued on to the back of the building and up some stairways at the back of the building to the 2nd floor. As we came out of on the 2nd floor, I saw through a doorway, a window in this doorway, a movement. So I went over and opened up the door, and this man was walking away from it. And the next room, I later found out was a coffee room.
As seen earlier by his fellow workers, Oswald was still alone in the lunchroom.
I called to the man, and he turned around, and Mr. Truly was there beside me, and I asked him if he knew this man or if he worked there. He said, yes, he does. He was calm, ordinary, you know. He didn't look excited or anything like that.
In order to fire the shots from the 6th floor, Oswald needed to squeeze his way out of the sniper's perch, pick his way between stacks of books to the far side of the building, hiding the gun en route, descend 4 flights of stairs to the lunchroom unobserved, and yet appear calm and unruffled in his encounter with Officer Baker, all within 90 seconds. Less than 15 minutes after the shooting, the police were broadcasting a wanted description that closely fitted Oswald. Who provided that description is not known, but it led to the immediate arrest of Oswald lookalikes, even in Fort Worth, 30 miles away.
Attention all squad. The suspect in the shooting at Elm in Houston is reported to be an unknown white male, approximately 30, slender build, height 5 feet 10 inches, weight 165 pounds, reported to be armed with what is thought to be a .30 caliber rifle.
Meanwhile, the real Oswald had made his way to a taxi rank a short distance from the depository, and after politely offering the first cab in line to another passenger, had asked to be driven to the street where he lived in Oak Cliff. At his lodgings, he rushed to his room, collected a jacket and revolver, and was last seen by his landlady shortly after 1 p.m., standing at the bus stop outside 1026 North Beckley. A mile from Oswald's rooming house, in another part of Oak Cliff, a further drama was unfolding. Waitress Helen Markham, on her way to work, was about to become the principal witness to a brutal slaying.
I was standing here on this corner when waiting on the traffic to pass so I could go down there and catch my bus to go to work. And a man come walking down the sidewalk, and a policeman came, and I could not get across.
The policeman in a patrol car was Officer J.D. Tippett. According to Helen Markham's account, Tippett stopped his car and got out to continue his conversation with the man on the sidewalk.
Just as the policeman got in front of the hood of the car, that man shot him 3 or 4 times. And then he put his gun back in his pants. He run over here, and I put my hands, I seen him coming, I just put my hands up on my face like this. I waited for a few minutes, and I opened them up, and I pulled them down. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I never said a word. And just like a flash of lightning, with big glassy eyes, he run off across the field, out that lot there, down, right across there, went over the fence and down the alley.
With Helen Markham, car dealer Ted Calloway was to become a principal witness for the Warren Commission. At a police identity parade later that day, they both picked out Lee Harvey Oswald as the killer of Officer J.D. Tippett.
I was sitting in my office when I heard what sounded to be 5 pistol shots coming from behind my office in the direction of 10th Street. Well, I jumped up, ran out to the sidewalk, and as I did, I saw a man jump through the hedge carrying a pistol, and he angled across the street to the sidewalk and continued to run in my direction, holding his pistol. When he got almost directly across from me, I yelled at him, "Hey man, what the hell is going on?" And he had his pistol right here, and he nearly stopped, and he turned in my direction and said something, but I couldn't understand what he said. So he continued walking down Patton Street. I called to a friend of mine. I said, "Follow that guy, see where he's going."
The different routes taken by the fleeing assailant are not the only contradictions in the accounts of these key witnesses.
He was wearing a light shirt, a brown jacket, and a light gray trousers.
He was wearing a black pair of trousers, a white shirt, and either a real light tan or a light gray Eisenhower-type windbreaker.
He was a short man, kind of small, and with a ruddy complexion.
He had real fair complexion, dark hair, and I found out later, the reason he had such fair complexion, that he'd killed a police officer and he was scared to death. So what it was, he was as pale as a ghost.
This man has devoted more time and energy than anyone to investigating the murder of Officer Tippit in Oak Cliff. After 12 years, researcher Larry Harris has uncovered important new evidence.
The Warren report concluded that Oswald had been walking east on 10th Street at the time he was encountered by Officer Tippit. And yet virtually all of the police, FBI, and Secret Service written reports from that weekend stated clearly that the man had been walking west on 10th Street, the opposite direction of Oswald. One of the witnesses to so state was Jim Burt, who was located on the corner of Denver and 10th Street. He sat on his front porch and stated he watched the man walking west on 10th Street up to the point where he encountered the police officer, and this is the man who did the shooting. The fact of the matter is that after 25 years, it's unclear just what transpired during the shooting here at 10th and Patton. One of the witnesses not known to the Warren Commission was a woman named Aquila Clemens, who was located in a house on the opposite side of the street. She came out immediately after the shooting and said she saw 2 men, one of whom was short and chunky, standing near the police car, and these men ran off in opposite directions. The bullets recovered from Tippit's body could not be traced to Oswald's revolver, nor apparently to any other revolver. There were references on the police radio tapes to an automatic weapon, 2 references. This is highly significant because Oswald was carrying a 6-shot revolver, not an automatic. According to the Warren report, Oswald continued on in a westerly direction toward the Texas Theater and was able to reverse the 6-block distance unimpeded, even though Jefferson Boulevard was swarming with police cars and bystanders searching for the suspect and closely scrutinizing any single white male that would have been walking in the area.
An agitated figure was seen to dodge into the Texas Theater without paying and disappear into the upstairs balcony. Butch Burroughs was the ticket collector on duty that day.
We were playing 2 movies called War is Hell with Audie Murphy and Cry Battle with Van Heflin. And we started the movie at 1 o'clock, and I was counting candy behind the candy case. And he also slipped in around between 1 and 1:07.
According to the official record, 1:07 was the time at which police officer Tippit was slain.
Here in Dallas, the man all America is looking at this time is 24-year-old Lee H. Oswald, being interrogated at the Dallas City Police Building. At the time of his arrest in a theater in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas, he was subdued after killing a Dallas police officer with a stub-nosed revolver, struggling with another officer, striking him with that pistol. And during that struggle, he was heard to shout, "It's all over now. I got me a president and a cop, and I'll try for 2 more." a fanatic in every sense of the word.
Mike Donald yelled for help, and the other officers in the theater and I managed to subdue the man, disarm him, and handcuff him. We asked him why he shot the officer, and he made the statement, "I haven't done anything to be ashamed of." This is all the information we got out of him on the way downtown. After we pulled into the basement and set up the wedge, we told him we would hold him in such a way that if he did not want his picture taken, he could duck down below the level of the outside guys walking around him and get into the station without anybody taking his picture. And here again, he says, "I haven't done anything to be ashamed of," and he did not try to hide his face in any way as we went in on the elevator up to the 3rd floor and set him in the interrogation room.
Except for the arresting officers, I was the first investigative officer that talked to him. He said he hadn't shot anybody, hadn't shot an officer or anybody else, and the only thing that he would admit to was hitting an officer in the mouth. He said, "No, or a cop in the mouth," is the way he put it. He said, "I will admit to hitting a cop in the mouth," but he said, "I won't admit to shooting anybody." And his answers that he would give to questions were as almost like they'd been rehearsed.
Sir, shoot the president. I work in that building. Were you in the building at the time? Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir. Back up, man. Did you shoot the president? No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. Did you shoot the president?
The prime piece of evidence against Oswald seemed to be the antiquated bolt-action rifle discovered on the 6th floor of the depository 30 minutes after the assassination. However, both the FBI and the Dallas police were unable to positively tie the weapon to Oswald. This became a matter of increasing embarrassment to Police Chief Jesse Curry.
Chief, we understand you have the results of the paraffin tests which were made to determine whether Oswald had fired a weapon. Can you tell us what those tests show?
I understand that it was positive.
What does that mean?
It only means that he fired a gun.
This doesn't...
Was there powder burns or powder marks on his cheek or
I don't know that. I don't know
All
that.
you know about on his hand.
Yeah.
That he fired a gun,
A
Chief,
gun.
not the rifle or the pistol.
That's right.
As the police tried to build a case against Oswald, officers were dispatched to question his wife, Marina. They were led by Detective Gus Rose.
We drove to the 6th Street address in Irving, address of Ruth Payne, and walked up the walk, and as I approached the door, a voice said, "Come on in, I've been expecting you." Questions that I asked Marina, I said, "Does your husband own a rifle?" She said, "Yes." And I said, "Do you know where it is?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "Can you show it to me?" And she said, "Yes." And she motioned for me to follow her. And she directed me into the kitchen part of the house where she opened a door that goes into a garage. And she pointed out in the garage to a rolled up blanket that was laying out there. And she said, being interpreted by Ruth Payne, "That's his rifle."
And the officer picked up the blanket roll and, just hung over his arm. And that was the point at which I felt that he could have been the one that killed the president. And I had this flood of feeling of, what they need to know. I'm going to help them know whatever they need to know. We're going to get to the bottom of this. But that was the first I had any inkling that he'd even had a gun.
You fire that rifle just as fast as you people have been given, but I emphatically deny these charges. Basic fundamental hygienic rights, like a shower and a clothes. These people have given me a hearing without legal representation or anything. You shoot the president? I didn't shoot anybody, no, sir. I'm just a cadaver.
There is no official record of Oswald's many hours of interrogation.
I was in the process of transferring him. I had a short conversation with him and where I said, "Lee, if anybody shoots at you, I hope that they are as good a shot as you are." Meaning that I hope if they shot at him, they'd hit him and not me. He kind of laughed and said, "Well, you're being melodramatic about it. I don't think anybody's going to shoot at me." And I said, "Well, in the event that they do shoot at you, you know what to do. You will be on the floor immediately." However, I didn't realize that just 2 or 3 minutes later, somebody would actually be shooting at him.
Even in Oswald's dying moments, the authorities desperately tried to wrest a confession from him. As Surgeon Paul Peters of Parkland Hospital explains.
There were Secret Service men intermingled with the operating room personnel, as there were dozens of people in the operating suite at that time, and some were dressed in green clothes as the surgeons so as to be indistinguishable from operating room personnel. And since it was known by those in the operating room that he was under little or no anesthesia, 2 or 3 people shouted in his ear, "Did you do it? Did you do it?" Which led me as a layman to speculate that perhaps a full-fledged confession might not yet have been obtained from Mr. Oswald.
Determined efforts by the Dallas police and the FBI in Washington had still failed to tie the prized rifle to Oswald. However, a smudged palm print was discovered on the weapon hours after a mysterious visit to the funeral home where Oswald's body had been taken by mortician Paul Grudy.
I had gotten to the funeral home with his body something in the neighborhood of 11 o'clock at night, and it is a several-hour procedure to prepare the remains. And after this time, someplace in the early morning, agents came. Now, I say agents because I'm not familiar at the moment with whether they were Secret Service or FBI or what they were, but agents did come, and when they did come, they fingerprinted. And the only reason that we knew they did, they were carrying a satchel and the equipment and asked us if they might have the preparation room to themselves. And after it was all over, we found ink on Lee Harvey's hands showing that they had fingerprinted him and palm printed him. We had to take that ink back off in order to prepare him for burial and to eliminate that ink. When we removed the casket from the little chapel, there wasn't any way that the help and I could handle it. Since there were only 2 of us, we decided the best thing to do. I solicited the newsmen that were there, and I asked them, would you mind helping me? And they volunteered and came over and carried the remains, the casket, to the coach, and then from the coach to the tent after I drove over to the gravesite. There were enough policemen there, one behind every tombstone, because they just didn't know what was going to be the next thing to happen. When the minister was through with a few brief words, the family then was given the privilege of, as in the business we call it the last leave, they had the opportunity to look at the body of Lee Harvey for a brief moment. And Marina, the wife, got up and patted his body and caressed him. Then she reached down and took a ring off of her finger, and actually it was 2 rings, and tried to place it on Lee Harvey's fingers, because this was the ring that was their wedding band, and I helped her because she was shaking and very nervous. Marina took a handful of dirt and made the sign of a cross on that grave. And then the family departed and went back to protective custody.
But the man given such a simple burial in Rose Hill Cemetery was far more complex than portrayed by history.
Well, Oswald was a pretty interesting fellow. He's not nearly the one-dimensional character that the Warren Commission has painted him to be. He was in the Marine Corps and did very well. He had a high security clearance. He was stationed over at Sugi. He was a radar operator. In fact, he was one of the guys that would track the U-2 flights over Russia. So it's not like he was the perennial loser that we tend to have this image of him now.
Some of the key pieces in the Oswald puzzle lie not in Dallas, but down in New Orleans, where he spent significant periods of his life. In an unbroadcast interview with a local radio and television station only months before the assassination, Oswald spoke about his life.
I was born in New Orleans in 1939. For a short length of time during my childhood, I lived in Texas and in New York. During my junior high school days, I attended Beauregard Junior High School. I attended that school for 2 years. Then I went to Warren Eastern High School, and I attended that school for over a year. Then my family and I moved to Texas, and I continued my schooling there. Then I entered the United States Marine Corps in 1956. I spent 3 years in the United States Marine Corps, starting out as a private, working my way up through the ranks to the position of buck sergeant, and I served honorably, having been discharged.
He had an honorable discharge, and then just a few weeks later wound up in Russia saying that he was going to renounce his American citizenship. And it's interesting that after he had supposedly said that, he was given a dishonorable discharge from the Marine Corps. It's fascinating that when he did go over to Russia and was introduced to the woman who later became his wife, his Russian was so good that she thought he was a Russian. So we suspect that he was trained. And it is known that the military in this country had training programs for defectors, and we suspect Oswald was in that program. We don't know it, but we suspect it.
A glimpse into his true role in Russia may have been revealed by the hesitant way in which he described his relationship with the American embassy there.
I worked in Russia. I was under the protection of that is to say, I was not under the protection of the American government, but that is, I was at all times considered an American citizen. At no time, as I say, did I renounce my citizenship or attempt to renounce my citizenship, and at no time was I out of contact or with the American embassy.
It's quite possible that his mission in Russia was sponsored by the U.S. State Department, which did participate in some fake defector programs back in those days. It's entirely possible, and it certainly would fit with the kind of person we think Lee Harvey Oswald was.
One person with no illusions about Oswald's role launched his own investigation into the Kennedy assassination in 1967. The former district attorney of New Orleans, Judge Jim Garrison.
He was employed by the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was obviously drawn into a scapegoat situation and made to believe ultimately that he was penetrating the assassination. And then when the time came, they took the scapegoat, the man who thought he was working for the United States government, and killed him real quick. And then the machinery, disinformation machinery started turning, and they started making a villain out of a man who genuinely was probably a hero.
6 months before the assassination, Oswald had taken a mundane job with the Riley Coffee Company, but it seems his real activities were centered a few blocks away. From a small office on the corner of Lafayette and Camp Street, Oswald managed a local chapter of the pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Operating from an adjoining office was a sinister figure named Guy Bannister.
About Guy Bannister, it's difficult to say much about him because he always stood in the shadows and pushed someone else to the front. He was a strongly disciplined man, perhaps the outgrowth of his many years as a special agent in charge of the Chicago office of the FBI. But he was a key man in the assassination. And that's clear from the fact that Oswald's sheep dipping, his being portrayed as a communist, was done out of Guy Bannister's office. So he was sheep dipped for months as a communist by given literature. Lee, hand this out today, this is your assignment. I came across the fact that Oswald, a private in the Marines, had taken a Russian examination. And I knew the privates did not take Russian examinations unless they were connected with intelligence. So that caused me to be curious about 544 Camp, which was the address stamped on one circular that they gave out one time before, obviously, Bannister told him, Lee, no more addresses. It turned out that was a side address of Guy Bannister's private detective agency. Well, I went down there to look at it, and I found myself not merely outside of Guy Bannister's office, but across the street from Naval Intelligence, across the street from Secret Service. Around the corner was the Crescent City Garage, the garage for the intelligence community. And then 2 doors away, the Riley Coffee Company. I used to be in the FBI. I knew people in Naval Intelligence, and they were either across the street, around the corner. The whole intelligence community was there, and right in the middle of it was Guy Bannister, having Oswald sheep dipped as a communist.
You're a Marxist? Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
What is the difference between the two?
Well, there's a great deal of difference. Several American parties in several countries are based on Marxism, such as Ghana. Certain countries have characteristics of a socialist system, such as Great Britain with its socialized medicine. These, then, are the differences between an outright communist country and countries which adhere to leftist or Marxist principles.
In your work with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, what are you advocating?
We advocate restoration of diplomatic, trade, and tourist relations with Cuba.
Most lunchtimes, would leave work and stroll down Magazine Street to the Crescent City garage, where government agents parked their cars and had them serviced. One such agent was observed contacting Oswald by the owner of the garage, Adrian Alba. During his lunch break, Oswald often sat in this office, browsing through gun magazines and chatting to Mr. Alba, who was also a keen rifleman. Oswald showed particular interest in how to go about ordering guns through the mail. The authorities tried to tie Oswald to the ordering of the assassination weapon by a coupon allegedly found amongst his possessions, torn from a June issue of one of Alba's gun magazines. Oswald, however, had ordered his rifle from a February issue of the magazine.
When the president ends up being assassinated and the scapegoat grabbed by the federal government and killed before anything can be done to help him, turns out to be the man that Guy Bannister has been the tutor of all the time, you have to conclude that Guy Bannister was a key man in the assassination and possibly the most important man that we encountered in our whole investigation. But he's been dead so many years, it's a little hard to question.
Clinton, a sleepy country town 130 miles from New Orleans, and the unlikely venue for the further sheep-dipping of Agent Oswald. Less than 3 months before the assassination, he arrived here with two strangers. During his brief stay, he made several attempts to get a job, in particular at the local state hospital. He is well remembered in neighboring Jackson by the town barber, Edwin McGeehee.
It was a lazy afternoon. Traffic was slow, and all of a sudden this stranger walks in the door. And how about a haircut? I said, fine. I got up, he sat down, and we started chatting, and he said, I said, how you doing? He said, fine. He says, do you know, he says, I'm looking for a job. And he says, do you know anything about it? You know any place where I can get a job? I said, the only place we have is East Louisiana State Hospital. But I said, do you know anybody can help you get on? And he says, I don't know of anybody. He says, I'm from New Orleans, and he said, I don't know anybody could help me. Well, I said, I can direct you to our representative, Mr. Reeves Morgan's house. And he jumped when I said it was a mental institution. He just jumped like that. And he says, do they have all kind of jobs there, like electricians? He said things like you say would make you remember him. That was my distinct impression. And he just didn't need a haircut. I don't know what he was up to.
Oswald could not drive, but nonetheless he took to the back lanes and found his way to the remote homestead of the local state representative, Reeves Morgan.
Well, I was in the house there burning some trash out of the fireplace that had accumulated, and I heard a knock on the door. I got up, and there was a young fella, and I invited him in, and he said he wanted a job over at the hospital. He understood they had a vacancy over there in the electrical department. He seemed like a nice young fella, about like the average fella, or maybe better than some of them.
I went to lunch on the day of the assassination around at my mother-in-law's house. She invited us, my wife and I, to eat. And his picture was flashed on the TV. And I said, my goodness, I said, I know that fella from somewhere.
I said, that's the same guy that was here. And Lee Harvey Oswald, he said he introduced himself as Oswald, Lee Oswald, he said. And I called the FBI man down there, and he said he knew he'd been up here already, and that's the last I ever heard of them.
And I said, surely they'll be by, you know. And I kept looking for them. They never did come by. And I thought that was strange.
The reason why they wanted to get Lee Oswald into the Jackson State Mental Hospital, was so that with a change of a document or two and picking up a doctor or two to testify for the government, they could make him appear to be insane. He was utterly sane, just as he was absolutely non-communist. But in the sheep-dipping program that was underway, it was important to try and make him appear to be crazy.
Bitterly protesting her son's innocence to the last, a forlorn Marguerite Oswald believed Lee had been grossly misrepresented to the world.
Lee Harvey Oswald, my son, even after his death, has done more for his country than any other living human being.
3 weeks after I buried Lee Harvey Oswald, the Secret Service came to me and they said, "Paul, did you see any scars, such as the scars on his wrists, where he was supposed to have tried to commit suicide in Russia?" And I said, of course, I wasn't looking for the likes of this, and really in my own mind did not feel as though I remembered much about this, but didn't remember seeing any marks of that kind. And the Secret Service agent told me at that time, "Well, Paul, we just don't know who we have out there in that grave."
That mystery did not end with Oswald's burial. Lingering doubts about the identity of the person buried at Rose Hill Cemetery, Fort Worth, prompted Oswald's widow, Marina, to have his body exhumed in 1981.
Being of Russian background and not truly trusting the American, she often wondered if his body was really there. So when it came the opportunity to possibly bring his body to the surface, she was most interested to know, is his body really there? Had somebody taken his body from the grave after the burial had been made? Well, that was her motive, partly. And then, too, I think she was interested to make sure that this was really Lee Harvey Oswald that was still there in that grave. At the time of the 63 of the burial time, I put Lee Harvey Oswald in a steel-reinforced concrete vault. That vault was hermetically sealed. The vault is guaranteed not to break, crack, or go to pieces. It's heavy concrete with steel in it, with an asphalt lining. And when I opened the grave in '81 and found that that vault had been broken, and the bottom of the vault was the part that was broken, the top was still intact, I noticed at that time that the casket had been disturbed. I questioned in my own mind what had been going on. When I opened that casket the first time, I sent my wife, Virginia, to Marina to tell her, yes, there is a body in that grave, because that was her concern. And then we did go to Baylor. There was an examination by a medical person who was a forensic pathologist. And she determined that, yes, these were the teeth of Lee Harvey Oswald, but it took 2 years for her to make that determination before the report was actually done.
The findings of the team are as follows. We independently and as a team have concluded beyond any doubt, and I mean beyond any doubt, that the individual buried under the name of Lee Harvey Oswald in Rose Hill Cemetery is, in fact, Lee Harvey Oswald. At this point in time, we hope that this puts the matter to rest without any further speculation being raised as to the identity of the individual at Rose Hill.
Oswald's dental record was used to confirm the identity of the exhumed body. But once again, the official version does not tell the whole story. Paul Grudy, an experienced mortician, made one vital observation that confounds their findings. He speaks about it here for the first time.
Of course, I was the one that had to handle the body in the morgue at Baylor. And as we removed the body from the casket, or at least worked with the body, I could recognize that this clothing was the clothing that I had put on that body. And yet, when I saw the head of this body, and it was removed from the casket and removed from the body in order that they might x-ray it and take pictures, I could see that there was no autopsy on that head. When an autopsy is done and the skull is cut in order to remove the cap, in order to remove the brain, there is a distinctive line of where all the fissures and all of the skull has been parted. Now, it's going to cause a bit of a mark. No matter what you try and do, it's going to show. And knowing that I handled the body originally, and there was an autopsy on that head, and now to see that there was no autopsy on the head, made it in my mind pretty clear that something had transpired that had caused this. And I feel as though someone had gone to the cemetery, off hours, had taken the head of Lee Harvey Oswald that now was dead. How he got that way, I don't know, but at least it was the head, and had brought the vault to the surface as best they could, being a heavy item as it is, a tripod, lifting that lifting the body and the vault out of the grave. In the process, the bottom of the vault fell, breaking the vault, causing the casket to deteriorate to a degree. Then, of course, removed the head of the one that was there that had been autopsied and put this head in its place so that we would find the teeth of Lee Harvey Oswald. That's my theory. This is what I think happened. Whoever caused that was the same faction that caused the assassination in the first place, but it, in my mind, a cover-up had taken place.
Lee Harvey Oswald was not the individual who assassinated President Kennedy, nor was he the individual responsible for policeman Tippett's death. I want to know why, after 25 years, the federal government of this country maintains that Oswald and Oswald alone was responsible for these murders.
The individual that I know is Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't think had it in him to be a person capable of committing such a crime as murdering the President of the United States. I'll always believe that. The side I saw to him was a very kind and loving man.
Dealey Plaza, Dallas, the public arena for the...
no one will ever convince me any differently that the shots came from the area of the picket fence on the grassy knoll. No one will ever convince me. I saw it. I believe that's where it came from. And the only way that I'm ever going to believe any different is when I stand before the judge on the judgment day and he tells me. But I know what I saw, and that's what I saw.
Major Phil Willis, with his wife and daughter, was also in Dealey Plaza. He is certain that the fatal headshot came from the grassy knoll.
Hell, I'll tell you, 90% of the people in Dallas, Texas, and probably the United States have heard all this over, have since decided that, as well as the second investigation held in the House of Representatives in Washington. And no one will ever convince me. I know damn well the shot that blew his head off came from the right front.
It had always seemed to me that had the car speeded up, had there been better reaction on the part of the driver, they were only yards from what at least I perceived to be safety by getting on the expressway. But the car seemed to just, it didn't move. After that first shot, it just didn't move. And the thing that has, over the years, continued to rather haunt me about the whole situation was the feeling that, did that first shot miss, as I felt it had? If it did miss, had that car speeded up, would he be alive today?
Even now, those eyewitnesses closest to the killing suffer their own haunting images from that dreadful day.
The headshot, seeing his head blow up, I can see it just as plain. It's red, it's very brilliant, it's cone shaped, going back. That's my impression. Sad, but true.
I would agree with my mother. The headshot is so traumatic and permanently emblazoned in my mind that that and the sadness of the assassination, that'll be, you know, forever in my memory. Very sad, very traumatic.
Went over on another knoll over the other side of Dealey Plaza and just lay down on the grass and vomited, and I was just sick. And then when we took my film out to Kodak out near Love Field and saw Air Force One taking off, and I listened to it on the radio, it was hard to believe it was true. And I began wondering then, and I have never stopped wondering to this day what this world might have been like if it had not happened.
It's affected my life in many, many ways. I suppose the most immediate effect was, as I said, I stopped being in some ways young on that day. I had been very idealistic, very politically involved. I had really believed that you could make changes. I saw that it didn't really matter what you had or what you did. It could all be gone in an instant, no matter who you were or what you had to offer. It could be gone in a flash, and that's a pretty profound thing to learn at 23 years of age, that it can just end, and for reasons that you have absolutely no control over. So in a sense, I said that was the day that marked the end of my youth. And I remember one line that always struck with me at the time. It said, "The most profound of sin is tragedy unremembered." And I've never forgotten that line, and I feel almost a duty. I don't get on soapboxes and talk about it all the time, but when there is an occasion, and particularly within my own family context, I feel it's very important to remind people what happened, and that it can happen again, and that nothing in life is a guarantee.
He wasn't just the president elected by some unknown party out there. He was elected by us, the citizens of the United States of America. He was my president, and I felt very personally violated. And then to see him assassinated that way, so graphically, was horrifying. My president.
As the motorcade slowly passed the grassy knoll in Dealey Plaza, the shots rang out, and Kennedy was dead before his car reached the underpass. When the Secret Service bodyguards finally realized what had happened, there was a frantic 4-mile dash along the Stemmons Freeway to the nearest hospital. At Parkland, Kennedy was rushed to Trauma Room 1, where surgeons did everything they could to revive him, despite the massive head wound observed by Dr. Robert McClelland.
It was not a small opening at all. I would estimate that probably a quarter or at least a fifth of the back right side of the skull was gone.
I stepped up and looked, and I could see inside President Kennedy's head on the right side near the back. We call it the occipito-parietal area. And the scalp had been torn apart there, and the skull had been blasted open by the effect of the high-velocity missile.
I thought it was probably an exit wound because, generally speaking, high-velocity missiles of that type will enter through a rather small opening, and by creating a blast effect and by the tumbling of the bullet, it will then, as it exits the body, leave a large hole, particularly large caliber bullets like from a .45 or from a deer rifle or something of this sort would cause that kind of massive exit wound.
We had taken the casket in the room in the meantime and prepared it, and Miss Kennedy came into the room, and she was, you know, standing there looking at him very calm, holding back tears, you know. It's just, she was emotional. I mean, she never did cry. And she took her wedding ring off her finger and tried to place it on his finger. Of course, his a lot larger, and so, you know, struggling with, I got some K-tail jelly there that they use and greased his finger, and we got it up on his finger as far as it got. And then the priest came into the room and administered the last rites to him.
They sent for Father Huber, and he was ushered in. There was a huge crowd, of course, milling out in the hall, and he was sort of shoved through the doors, and the scene, I'm sure, was overwhelming for him, as it was for most of us. Our president was lying there dead, his wife grief-stricken, and all of us more or less stunned. And so he came in and turned to his little book and started reciting something which he considered appropriate, and Mrs. Kennedy felt that, probably rightly so, that he wasn't giving the proper phraseology at that time, and she said, no, don't you understand? The final unction, the final unction. And he turned to another place in his book and began reading, which appeared appropriate, and it seemed to have a soothing effect on her, and he finished the appropriate phrases, and Mrs. Kennedy bent over and kissed her husband and took his ring from his finger. And then she went outside the door of this small room and sat down on a chair immediately outside the room.
I didn't see the wounds. They had him completely, his head was completely wrapped in a sheet-type bandage. The body, he was nude. When we pick up a body, as we train at it, my position was to take the head, place my hand underneath the head, and the other hand goes underneath the back of the spine at the waist. Then Peanuts, his hand goes next to mine on the waist, and he gets below the knees wherever we can stretch the person out. And we picked him up, and the back of his head felt like a wet sponge. It was just real soft, and as if, you know, it was, part of his skull was missing. It was just that soft.
While the president lay dead at Parkland, another tragedy was unfolding a short distance from downtown, in the Oak Cliff district, where police officer J.D. Tippit had been gunned down by an unknown assailant.
It came out over the radio that the suspect had gone into the Texas Theater. Well, we continued on into Texas Theater, and Kenneth and I entered the theater, and about the time we entered, well, some more officers came in behind us, and there were also some officers around the back.
While we were in the theater, probably 150 to 200 people had gathered out front of the theater attracted there by all the noise. They had been told on television that the president had been shot. At this point, nobody knew whether he was dead or not. All these things happening this close together, they thought probably the suspect we had was maybe connected with the shooting of the president. And so we were hearing yells like, "Get him, let's kill him, let's take him." And we were all thinking, well, we just had to risk our lives and fight over a gun to get the man, and here we are, we may have to shoot somebody else to keep him.
When Oswald was first brought into the homicide office, I heard this commotion and I looked up and I saw him. He was handcuffed with his hands handcuffed behind his back. And at that time, he refused to tell me who he was. He said something to the effect, "Well, you're the cop, you figure it out."
Later that day, Detective Rose led a search of the house in Irving, where Oswald's wife, Marina, lodged with her friend, Ruth Payne.
6 officers came to the door, and they said they had Oswald in custody for shooting an officer, no reference to the president, and they asked if they could come in. I asked if they had a warrant, and they said no, but we could get one right away, and they were obviously very tense and nervous, and I, was stunned by their arrival.
On Saturday morning, after the assassination on Friday, we went back to the Payne residence in Irving. I had obtained a search warrant from Judge Joe Brown, Jr., and wanted to do a more thorough search than I had previously done of that residence. Some of the items we found in this search was a photograph of Oswald standing in front of a house with a rifle in one hand, a newspaper in the other hand, and a pistol on his hip.
At no time did I suspect he had any kind of gun. That picture showed up later with that Marina had taken. I recognized the location as the back of their Neely Street apartment, because she'd taken me out there to pick some flowers to take home one time when I was visiting there in the spring before. And as you know, that he was carrying both the rifle and the pistol at that point.
Other items we found was, of course, a small Minox Miniature camera, it's called. It had a roll of film in it. We never did develop that film. It was later turned over to the FBI, so I don't know what turned out to be on that film.
We found a great amount of communist literature, communist books. I couldn't tell you just what all it was, but it was a large box.
We brought all the evidence in, and Captain Fritz decided to conduct a further interview of Oswald and had him brought into the homicide office for interrogation. I sat in on that interrogation. Captain Fritz at one point said, "Mr. Oswald, you told us that you had never owned a rifle or a gun or a weapon of any sort. Is that right?" And he said, "That's right. I never owned a gun in my life." So Captain Fritz showed him the photograph and said, "Well, how do you explain this?" He looked at it, and he got visibly mad. He seemed shaken, and he said, "Well, that's just simply my face superimposed on someone else's body there. That's all that is."
Another senior detective sitting in on Oswald's high-level interrogations that weekend was Jim Lavelle.
Mr. Kelly with the Secret Service, who was the head of the Secret Service out of Washington, had flown in, I guess it was the next day, perhaps on Saturday, asked him if he knew anybody named Alex Hidell. He answered no, and they asked him if he had ever used that name at any time, and he answered no. And he said, "Well, isn't it a fact that when you were arrested, you had an identification card with your picture on it and that name on it and your billfold?" He said, "I believe that is correct." And Mr. Kelly said, "Well, how do you explain that?" And he said, "I don't." During my tenure with him, he was a very calm and cool and collected individual. All of his answers were very concise and to the point. He didn't volunteer information, and he certainly didn't admit to anything. Mr. Kelly also, in the same time when he asked him about the Alex Hidell, he knew that Oswald had been involved in this fair play for Cuba in New Orleans. And he asked him, he said, now that the president has been killed, He says, do you think that the attitude of the United States towards Cuba will change? And Oswald looked around to his left where Captain Fritz was sitting, and he said, I believe that I am charged with the murder of the president. Is that correct? And Captain Fritz said, yes, that's true. And he turned back to Mr. Kelly and he said, I don't think that I should answer that, because whatever answer I give you might be construed in a different light than what I intended it to be. He said, however, in all countries, and this country is no exception, when a leader of the country either dies or gets killed or something, there's always a second in command that takes over. And he said, in this case, I believe his name is Johnson, and I don't think that his views towards Cuba are any different than the president's.
An early arrival at police headquarters was the FBI agent in Dallas who'd been assigned to keep an eye on Oswald prior to the assassination, James Hosty.
His behavior when I talked to him on the afternoon of the assassination for approximately 1 hour was that of a person who was very calm, cool, and collected. He claimed that he was in the lunchroom at the time of the assassination by himself. He was also asked by Captain Fritz, did he bring a weapon into the building that day, and he said no, he had not, but he had seen the manager, Mr. Truly, had brought a rifle into the building a day or two before. This was later checked out and proved to be true, that Mr. Truly had brought a rifle in and he was going to go deer hunting with it and shown it to several of the people in the building. The interview was terminated because Oswald was taken out for a lineup.
Oswald was placed in 4 different lineups, 3 on Friday, a 4th on Saturday. In the first 2 lineups, Oswald appeared with 2 police detectives and a jail clerk. These men were wearing clothing quite a bit nicer than Oswald, but moreover, they did not resemble Oswald in appearance. They were heavier, older. One of them had blonde hair. The police gave fictitious names and occupations. Oswald gave his real name, his real occupation, to Texas School Book Depository. This information was being widely disseminated even by the time of the first lineup. In the second and third lineups, Oswald appeared with men who were quite a bit heavier, older. Some of them had blonde hair. And in the 4th lineup, which was the most outrageous of all, Oswald appeared in the lineup with 2 teenagers and a Mexican. And in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th lineups, Oswald complained bitterly to police about the manner in which the lineups were being conducted. And he berated the police, demanded legal representation, and it was very, very apparent to any witnesses that Oswald was the suspect. There are established criteria for the fair and proper conduct of police lineups. By any stretch of the imagination, every rule in the book was violated by the Dallas police in the conduct of each of the 4 lineups that weekend.
When they first filed against Oswald for killing President Kennedy, they put in the complaint that Oswald did kill President Kennedy in the furtherance of an international communist conspiracy. The White House called down to the district attorney and vehemently objected to that, in which then the district attorney removed this statement from the original complaint. Because of this, the White House was extremely upset with the local authorities, and we were under the strictest orders not to give them any information whatsoever at all about Oswald. This caused them to jump to the wrong conclusion and think that we were hiding something about ourselves when we were really cloaking the information about Oswald's Soviet and Cuban connections.
In Mexico City, 2 months before the assassination, a man claiming to be Oswald had visited both the Soviet and Cuban embassies, demanding a visa allowing him to travel to Russia via Cuba. He was unsuccessful. The American authorities were aware of this trip.
I asked him if he'd ever been to Mexico City, and he became quite upset about that, but this was more, he was more startled. And he said something to the effect, how did you know about that? And then wouldn't speak about it anymore.
Whether it was Oswald or an imposter in Mexico City, it was a connection that the American authorities were anxious to conceal at all costs. James Hosty gives the official explanation for this cover-up.
Oswald had been in contact with V.V. Kostakov, who was the Soviet KGB chief of assassinations and sabotage for the Western Hemisphere. I think the fact that Oswald had been in contact shortly before the assassination with a person of that nature, and due to the fact that he had spent 3 years in Russia, this would have caused the American public to become so outraged that it could have led to World War III. I believe for this reason they decided that they would keep this from the American public.
Whatever the real mission was in Mexico City, the American authorities at the highest level were determined that it should never be revealed.
In Mexico City, the CIA agents were instructed to cease and desist their investigation of a possible Castro connection to Oswald's assassinating of President Kennedy. There was a near mutiny among the CIA agents over this order to stop the investigation. The ambassador to Mexico City stated he was given orders from his superiors to stop the investigation, and then commented, well, if the president's own brother agreed with it, I guess we'd have to go along with it, which would indicate to me that Attorney General Robert Kennedy concurred with the order to stop the investigation of the Castro connection to Oswald.
In the holding cells of police headquarters in downtown Dallas, time was running out for Oswald. Throughout the relentless interrogations, he had offered no information other than vehemently protesting his innocence of the murders of both the president and Officer Tippit. 24 hours after his arrest, he was still without legal representation.
Oswald called me from the jail on Saturday after the assassination. He actually called twice. The first time in the afternoon, he just asked me to try to reach a lawyer that he was trying to get to represent him. And I said I would, because I thought he should have representation, but I frankly was stunned that he called, that he asked for something from me at that point. That was a very brief conversation, and his voice was very flat. Detached, like as if there was no momentous event going on around him or around me. And then he called again in the evening to try to reach Marina, and just asked for Marina just as if it were any weeknight after work. And he normally did call her then. Again, just very detached, very, very separated, it seemed to me, from what was going on.
For the rest of that day, and most of the following morning, Oswald's time was filled with more unrecorded interviews with police officials. Shortly after 11 o'clock on the Sunday morning, his move to the greater security of the Dallas County Jail began.
When we started to transfer him that morning, we brought his stuff down to him, and that included a couple of sweaters. I believe one was a beige and one was a black sweater. And it was a little cool, so we asked him if he wanted to wear one of the sweaters, and he said yes. And I asked him which one. He said, I believe I'll wear the beige one. And he started to take it, and he said, no. I said, I think I want to wear the black one. I don't know why, because it wasn't the best sweater. But anyway, took the cuffs off of him and gave him the sweater, and he put it on and cuffed him again.
And in talking with Chief there, I suggested to him that morning that we take Oswald out of the elevator on the first floor, put him in a car on Main Street where there wasn't any people, and we could be into the county jail before anyone realized that we were transferring him.
But he did not agree to that because we were already obligated to transfer him so the press could take pictures and everybody else could see it. So, you know what happened. Ruby shot him and us holding him, so which is not good.
Now the prisoner wearing a black sweater, he has changed from his T-shirt, is being moved out toward an armored car, being led out by Captain Fritz. There is the prisoner. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Oswald has been shot. Oswald has been shot. Mass confusion here. Holy mackerel. A shot rang out as he was led into his car. The shot There's a mass confusion there.
I had Oswald, in addition to being handcuffed to him, I had my left hand hooked into his belt on his right-hand side. And I pulled back with him, trying to pull him behind me. But without any leverage, I wasn't able to move him to any distance. What I succeeded in doing was turning his body a little bit. Ruby would have shot him if I had not turned him dead center just about where the navel is. As a result, by me pulling on him, trying to turn him in that reflex action, he shot him over here about 4 inches to the left of the navel. The bullet went all the way through him and lodged just under the skin on the right-hand side. If it had been a little better, a little higher caliber or more powder in the bullet, it would have gone on through him and hit me approximately in the same place. But it stopped just under the skin, and I could roll it around under the skin just like a seed in a grape.
I stood beside Dr. Shires and watched the efforts to salvage Mr. Oswald. I remember that he was given pure oxygen because he was already unconscious, and little or no anesthesia. And when the abdomen was opened, one could hear the blood escaping from the aorta. And he received 18 pints of blood within the next few minutes in an effort to resuscitate him. And he did recover a blood pressure for a moment or two and began to move his arms. You may recall that the bullet had entered his left chest, had gone through the stomach, the spleen, had torn the superior mesenteric artery on the aorta, gone through the vena cava, passed through the upper pole of the right kidney, buried itself through the liver and into the skin of the abdominal wall on the opposite side. And at that time, there were few, if any, survivors in America of a simultaneous injury to the aorta and vena cava, which was the major injury that Mr. Oswald sustained.
I was probably about 20 to 25 feet from the point of the shooting, and I was looking in that direction. And when the shot was fired, it didn't really sound like a pistol shot. It was a muffled sound, but I knew that it was a shot. And my first thought was that probably some older officer that was ready to retire, that was probably, I figured, bereaved and grieved over the shooting of Tippit, that really that's what my first thought was, that it was some policeman that shot him.
My first thought was that one of my fellow officers had shot Oswald. But as the crowd began hollering, the gun passed in front of my face, and I grabbed at it, but I missed it, and I kept hollering, "Somebody get that gun, somebody get that gun." And there was a voice came from this pile of humanity that said they had the gun. Then suddenly I ended up with Ruby. We drug him back into the jail office where we restrained him and began to get handcuffs on him. Chief Curry, along with Captain Fritz and other top administrators, had originally planned, it was my understanding, to transfer Oswald during the night. But outside political pressures coming from as far as Washington insisted that Oswald be shown that he hadn't been coerced into a confession, that he hadn't been beaten, and that the world exposure be granted on this subject. After all, he was an assassin accused in killing the President of the United States.
Chief Curry did not have the final say as to when or how Oswald was transferred. It came from his superior, which was the city manager at that time. So, again, we knew better than to transfer him under those conditions, but we didn't have any choice.
I was fairly certain in my mind when I saw Lee Oswald lying on the floor that he was going to die. And then I went to Parkland Hospital, and certainly he was dead. And that's when I met his wife, Marina, and his mother, Marguerite. Marina, through an interpreter from SMU, a Russian interpreter, she asked him that could she see the body. And the doctor told me, said that she shouldn't see the body. They just done an autopsy on him, and he wasn't even cleaned up yet. But she insisted on seeing.
Paul O'Connor was a medical orderly who assisted at President Kennedy's autopsy on the night of the assassination. For many years, he was prevented, under threat of court-martial, from talking about his frightening experience.
It was such a relief when the House Assassination Committee allowed me to talk. Then I could get it off my chest. It was such a relief to do that. And I'm glad it was brought out of the closet. At least I don't have to walk around the rest of my life bursting at the seams waiting to say, you people don't realize what I did or what I saw. You just believe what you heard or told to believe. And you know he was shot, you know he was dead, and you know he was buried. And that's all the general public knew. They didn't know about what we knew. And that was a hell of a feeling to carry around with you.
In speaking out about what he saw at the Washington autopsy, Paul O'Connor has exposed major discrepancies in the official account of the events of that night, and in particular, the president's wounds. In Dallas, minutes after the assassination, the doctors at Parkland Hospital, in addition to noting a large wound in the back of Kennedy's head, had also observed a small wound in his throat, as Dr. Robert McClelland explains.
Dr. Perry told me as I was helping him do the tracheostomy that he had made the incision, which goes this direction across the neck, for placement of the tube in the windpipe through the little wound that had been in the front part of the neck, apparently about here, and as I understand, nicked the tie a little bit in coming through. And I estimate from what he told me that the size of that tiny little injury on the front part of the neck was perhaps the size of the end of my little finger, very small. What I would usually think about that kind of wound and what I thought about that one from his description of it was that it was most likely an entrance wound.
Saw a picture of the throat wound. Nice little neat wound about like this is what they showed in the picture. When it actually was a great big nasty blown out wound. Just big mess. Why they would say this is what it looked like when it didn't is just beyond me. Because the rendition is just totally fabricated.
But the official autopsy photographs are not the only dubious aspect of that night's activities.
When somebody is shot and killed, they usually do what they call a legal post-mortem. And that involves plotting a trajectory of a missile, where it comes in and goes out, and what angle it was. And we didn't do any of that at all. They weren't really interested, it seems, that on how it happened, where it happened from. Nobody had mentioned whether he had got shot in the front or the back or the side or what. I remember that Dr. Humes was just about ready to pull his hair out because he was a very meticulous person. And he'd start to do something, and Admiral Berkeley would say, "Don't do that," and he'd just tense all up, and we'd have to go to some other procedure. And I thought to myself, this is a very unbelievable, strange night. I felt like I was in some kind of a horror story that was real. But what really scared me was about several days later, after the autopsy, we were ordered into the commanding officer's office, all of us that had anything to do with the autopsy, where we signed orders that stated under penalty of general court-martial, you will not divulge any information or talk to anybody. That's what scared me.
Dr. Cyril Wecht, a distinguished forensic pathologist and a fearless critic of the cover-up, believes the truth can still be established.
I think it would still be possible, even today, to determine how, in fact, John Kennedy was killed, to be able to prove that there were two people firing. I would like to see a real murder investigation conducted. I would like to see FBI agents and other law enforcement people going to individuals who are involved in the chain of custody, find out where the brain is, find out where the Kodachromes of the interior chest wounds are, find out where the microscopic tissue slides are, I would like to see all of the evidence brought together and a thorough scientific analysis undertaken. I would also like to see repeat experiments done shooting a Mannlicher Carcano with 6.5 millimeter military-type ammunition through goat carcasses and human cadavers to simulate the bony fractures in Governor John Connally, and let's see what those bullets look like. Those things can be done. If they are done, then I am convinced that the Warren Commission report will crumble like a house of cards. And of course, the people on the other side, they're not stupid. They are also convinced that that is what would happen, and that is exactly why such a new investigation is not being undertaken.
But the questioning voice of the American people refuses to be silenced. Each year on the anniversary of the assassination, a dedicated band of disbelievers meet on the grassy knoll in Dealey Plaza, typical of those millions of Americans who've refused to swallow their government's official line. Through their diverse efforts and their persistence, critics such as these have kept the quest for the truth alive.
As with most people, I believed the Warren report at first. I think we all had to. We needed to know that there was no nameless they that got away with this, that it had been solved. But the more that was written, the more that we learned, the more questions there were. For every question that was answered, there were 10 more new ones that needed to be answered. And I felt that for my own sake, for all of our peace of mind, we needed to know more of what happened to President Kennedy. They didn't tell us the truth.
It's a very valid criticism of the Warren Commission that it failed to follow up many, many important leads and witnesses that came to its attention. One of the best examples, I think, is the fake Secret Service man up on the grassy knoll and a Dallas police officer. Within a minute or two after the shooting, Officer Joe Marshall Smith ran up on the grassy knoll following the other witnesses. That's where they all went initially. And Joe Smith pulled his pistol when he spotted a man behind the picket fence up on the grassy knoll. And this was a man dressed in coat and tie. And this man, even looking right into Smith's revolver, said, "Hey, I'm Secret Service." And he pulled out some credentials that, to Officer Smith, indicated that this man was legitimate. Smith left him alone and went away, investigating other areas in the plaza. The important part is that the Secret Service at no time had any agents anywhere in Dealey Plaza, with the exception of the agents who were riding in the motorcade. So here's a guy passing himself off as a Secret Service agent to a Dallas police officer, and there was no Secret Service agent there. The Warren Commission either didn't know that or didn't want to know. They didn't even ask Officer Smith pertinent questions about that encounter. And to me, that's one of the great failings of the Warren Commission, and a typical example how important evidence was overlooked initially or lost at that time. There was some new evidence that came out in late 1976, evidence that I was responsible for, in that the researchers had long been aware of recordings of the Dallas Police Department's radio channels. The department was using 2 at that time. And some interference began just a couple minutes before the assassination occurred. And that interference continued for 5 minutes or so after the assassination, and it effectively blocked all police communications on their main channel. What wasn't known was which officer was responsible for it. My thinking was that if the officer were in or very close to Dealey Plaza, his open microphone may have picked up the sound of the shots. From that theory sprang an investigation by the House Assassinations Committee, and after some digging they found what they thought were the original recordings. They had the scientists analyze the recordings and decided that after some tests and then firing some test shots in Dealey Plaza and recording those, that there were 4 shots fired during the assassination, perhaps as many as 6. And that, of course, proved conspiracy.
For 2 years, through political turmoil, the House Committee flourished. It investigated areas that needed to be investigated, some that we hadn't thought of before. Others, unfortunately, were overlooked. And as a result, after the dust cleared, we were given a report. The report said, yes, there was a conspiracy, but a very limited conspiracy. There were at least 2 people firing at President Kennedy. Much of the evidence leading toward involvement of government investigative agencies, perhaps in the actual murder, perhaps just in the cover-up, were all pretty much glossed over. Some recommendations were made to the Justice Department. They were never followed through. During the House Assassinations Committee hearings, the FBI and CIA admitted that they had withheld evidence, that they had obstructed justice. Not a single person was ever put to task for this. They were just allowed to go, and that's the way it remains till this day. We can't know the truth unless we have subpoena power and people that want to know the truth. If they don't want to know the truth, whether because they don't believe in it or because they feel it's politically advantageous to themselves not to investigate it, then we'll never know the truth. But how can this country go on after a quarter of a century of this cover-up? How can we build on that? We're building on a lie. We've got to know the truth.
The House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded, primarily on the acoustics evidence, but not exclusively, that there were 2 people firing shots in Dealey Plaza. And they decided, based on the scientific evidence that took a period of some 9 to 10 months to analyze fully, that shots number 1, number 2, and number 4 all came from the Texas School Book Depository building. But shot number 3 did come from the grassy knoll to the president's right front. Therefore, it's inescapable. Conspiracy because there were at least 2 shooters. So all this means that according to the United States government, there are now 2 official conclusions as to what happened. The Warren Commission says there was 1 shooter and 3 shots. The House Assassinations Committee says 2 shooters, a total of 4 shots. There's a conspiracy or there isn't. That's where we're stuck, and we have been since 1978.
Given the nature of the president's most powerful enemies at that time, and who had the most to gain from the assassination, my feeling is that there are 4 groups that are suspect. The more militarily oriented of the anti-Castro Cubans, the people who felt betrayed by President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, the mob, who wanted the gaming rights back in Havana. They were losing millions of dollars every day since Castro closed the casinos. The ultra-right wing, who hated President Kennedy for virtually everything he stood for. And the ultra-right wing hawks within the CIA, the ones who had been fired, or people related to those politically, who had been fired by President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs. They all had a common goal. They wanted the president out of the way. They wanted Cuba clear of Castro and the communist threat in the Western Hemisphere. They had the most to gain. They had the motive, the opportunity, and the means to kill President Kennedy. If that is the cake, then the icing on the cake is the president's decision to withdraw the troops from Vietnam. That was the CIA's war. They wanted it, they wanted to promote it, they wanted to push it.
The people who I think had most to gain, as they saw it, were the military-industrial intelligence complex. It's a myth that the intelligence agents don't make policy. They make it all the time. They always say they're carrying out policy, and sometimes they are. The people who had most to gain were those who didn't want the peace in the world that John Kennedy had tried to turn the world toward when he and Khrushchev worked out the solution to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The people who didn't want John Kennedy to be president were those who were making incredible fortunes from war production.
Had Kennedy lived, I think we'd have had no Vietnam War, with all of its traumatic and divisive influences in America. I think we would have escaped that. I think the world would have escaped the 50,000 odd Americans dead and 300,000 more wounded and over 500,000 more hooked on dangerous drugs and tropical diseases. The divisiveness of that war that so many of the people thought unjustified and unnecessary and it shouldn't have been there. It split this country widely, and many of those things have lingered on since.
Kennedy made a speech at American University in June of the year before he died, and he said, we live in one world, we got to breathe in the same air, and we got to live together, we're going to die together. He was very disturbed by our involvement in Vietnam, which he inherited. And there came a time when he called his generals in and spoke to them, and after he spoke to them, the Pentagon issued a small statement saying that we have re-evaluated our involvement in Vietnam and find that we can begin to withdraw our men. The plan was to begin by withdrawing 1,000 a month. 17,000 were to be withdrawn by the time of the election, which was a year later. One plane load reached the United States when John Kennedy was killed. 3 days after the assassination, the body wasn't yet in the ground. The Pentagon issued what it called a re-evaluation of its re-evaluation. And they said simply that we found that our re-evaluation was optimistic. And the rest is history. The whole world turned around on it. The world will not, within the lifetime of anybody living today, recover from just that.
Kennedy represented the voice of hope, a voice of opportunity, a voice for the future, uplift. People were could hardly stand on their feet. They'd jump up and down when he came along the street. And this great voice of hope for the future of a better America was stilled by the assassin's bullets. And people were depressed and mourned over it and thought we have lost our brightest and best in the head.
The most important effect once the Warren Report came out was disenchantment and disillusionment, especially of that college generation. I can't tell you how many collegiate audience reflected this. All people of all ages reflected it on the radio talk shows, which spent a lot of time on this. So people lost their faith in the government, and the government earned that loss of faith. And I think perhaps the second is more important, that when the government justifies a loss of faith, it really is a deep subversion.
The strongest ally the cover-up has had has been the American media, both because they are unable or unwilling to accept the conspiracy or the fact of a conspiracy, or because they know better and are serving their masters well. One of the two.
None of the things that the critics brought to light were treated responsibly by any responsible element of the press. If it hadn't been for the kookiest of all, the radio talk shows, we critics would not have been able to reach the people we did, and they were very important. The Washington Post resisted it, the New York Times resisted it, the major TV networks resisted it, unless you had something nutty, unless you had something dramatic, unless you had something they knew wasn't true. But substantial criticism never had a voice. And that's what the working of a democratic society requires. Most of all, when it's a crime of the magnitude of the subversiveness of this one, the assassination of a president.
If the press would just open their eyes, if the media would accept the fact of the conspiracy, instead of just arbitrarily disbelieving, we'd have some allies. A handful of critics and researchers in this case have gotten remarkably far on their own. But if the press would just be honest about it and question and do their job, we could learn a lot more. The fact of the assassination conspiracy is beyond doubt. Only the scope is in question.
I'm a first-generation American. I'm the first member of my family born at least since the time of Christ. I can't go back to Adam. In freedom. None of my predecessors ever had it. And I've been a writer, an investigative reporter, a Senate investigator, an intelligence analyst. And the older I get, the more convinced I become that despite all its failings, we have the best system of self-government man has yet perfected, and it's got so many failings. But for the system to work, those who are responsible for seeing to it that it works have to see to it that it works. In this case, didn't happen. They
And the exiting bullet has gone through the brain, and you can see the path of the bullet here. Lee Harvey Oswald did not and could not have fired the fatal shot that killed our president.
Tom Wilson's ability to extract hidden information from the assassination pictures is based on established scientific principles.
This is photonics. This is the absolute science in the measurement of light. What is in these photographs and what is measured by the computer and backed up by hard scientific mathematical data. All of my findings can be reproduced.
Badgeman shooting from the grassy knoll was first revealed in Mary Moorman's picture in The Men Who Killed Kennedy in 1988. Tom's initial work confirmed his presence. This encouraged him to apply his technology to photographic records of the assassination.
The Zapruder film allowed me to be able to go in and look at the head wound initially. The autopsy photographs allowed me to verify that there were inconsistencies within, and the pristine Mary Moorman photograph allowed me to go in and actually measure the wound optically without image processing. As we go into the wound and as we expand the wound and magnify it, you can see that the pixel elements, or each one of these little dots, is represented by dark squares or light squares. Now, if there were no wound in the rear of President Kennedy's head, all of the squares would be the basic reflective value or the basic shade of gray that his normal hair coloring would be on this day. Every time, in my years of experience with this, when there is a concave or convex area that is a deformation of the overall image, there is absolutely no question that the case is, as it goes darker under this situation, that this is going from an area on the top of President Kennedy's head down into an extremely deep hole, because the entrance wound that supported this exit wound was fired from the right frontal area of President Kennedy, and it exited through the rear. Instead of trying to find shooters or gunmen in the photographs, I decided to concentrate on President Kennedy's massive rear-end head wound. And what this enabled me to do was to be able to go in, rebuild the head wound as a mold, use the data thereof, and track back from the head wound back to the source of the shooter. This is a mold that was reproduced from the data points obtained from the pristine Mary Moorman photograph. I took 8 vertical scans, 1, 2, and so forth, down to the bottom, and 750 horizontal scans, which allowed me to have 6,000 pieces of mathematical data that I could actually turn into a 3-dimensional mold. I was able to produce the exact replica, not to scale, of course, but an exact replica of President Kennedy's head wound. As you can see, this allowed me to be able to show the massive amount of material that was blown from the head into the air. As the bullet entered the right temporal area, it came within his head and fragmented into 2 directions. The right fragment is here, the left fragment is here. And this allowed me to determine, as you can see with all the flow of forces here, that all of the material was blown up and the entrance of the fragments came from below.
Having gathered extensive mathematical data from the assassination images, Tom went to Dealey Plaza for the first time. Taking precise measurements from the site, he correlated these with his photographic findings. The results were not as he anticipated.
When I came back and took these coordinates, which were mapped out using the machinery, not manual calculations, I could never put President Kennedy at the spot where the Zapruder film said was frame 313 when Badgeman was firing, because the projectile trajectory from Badgeman wasn't where Kennedy was. And when I put President Kennedy down the road 4 feet further, when Badgeman could hit him, Mary Moorman was in the wrong location Mr. Zapruder wouldn't fit. The fence was in the wrong place. I could not make anything fit. So I had to go back to Dallas, and I had to run more tests. And what I found out was something that I had overlooked all this time in looking at the photograph. President Kennedy's wound in his right temporal area is at an angle like this. It's coming out of the ground. And I said to myself, Tom, if the bullet was coming out of the ground, how is this possible? Because I never tried to determine where the bullet came from. I only know what it did to President Kennedy's head. This totally bewildered me that I'm at the end of this mission. President Kennedy was assassinated by a man firing a missile from inside the manhole cover at the bottom of the steps in Dealey Plaza. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that that is exactly where that headshot came from.
Jack Brazil, a seasoned researcher of the assassination, believes that a gunman firing at Kennedy from the storm sewer is no wild theory. In 1992, he put his ideas to the test with a trained military team. They explored the subterranean world beneath Dealey Plaza.
After carefully analyzing and researching Dealey Plaza through the years, the only two spots that an assassin could actually hide and squeeze off around at the presidential limousine would be the storm sewer that I'm standing in now and the storm drain, which is located directly behind the wooden picket fence that joins the triple underpass. But that's the only two spots that an assassin could hide in and actually squeeze off around and fire at the presidential limousine, and then, in lieu of that, been able to escape. It took us approximately 53 to 54 minutes, our very first trip. Now that was stopping and investigating and talking on the walkie-talkies, 2 coffee breaks, and then the second time it took 42 minutes, and the third trip it took 32 minutes, and the fourth trip it took 23 minutes. So we can rest assured that it would take an assassin approximately 20 to 30 minutes to actually escape Dealey Plaza underground. This ties in to the storm sewer in the center of Main Street, and it's easily accessible for a would-be assassin, and he could very easily have shot the president and used this route for an escape, which leads directly to the Trinity River.
The official autopsy photographs taken at Bethesda Naval Hospital on the evening of the assassination show no indication of a frontal entrance wound to Kennedy's head or exit wound from the rear. However, Tom Wilson has uncovered new evidence showing that these images have been manipulated to support the official line of a lone gunman firing from behind.
The dark areas represent material that are human and or environmental. The white areas represent mortician's materials such as wax. Some of the obvious areas of disguise are the ear, where you can see the wax material has been over top of the human ear. The entire face has been covered with mortician's wax and materials. And most important, the right temporal area, which is the entrance area of the incoming missile, has been filled with mortician's wax. I'm not saying that restorative art was not done to President Kennedy before he was buried. What I'm saying is, how can an autopsy photograph have restorative art on a cadaver?
Tom can prove that another official autopsy photograph, first seen in The Men Who Killed Kennedy and showing the back of the president's head intact, has been forged.
When image processing looks at this image, the real image that should be seen is this image. And all of the area that looks like it is solid white and nice, evenly coated white is a photographic manipulation of the image. It is not a man-made mortician-type material. It is a painted image on a photograph. It is my concerted opinion that this photograph was manipulated for only one thing, and that was to hide the massive exit wound that occurred in the rear of President Kennedy's head.
Lieutenant Colonel Dan Marvin has spent his life serving his country. A veteran of 8 combat campaigns, he earned 21 awards and decorations. 15 years a paratrooper, he served in the elite special forces, the Green Berets. Just a few weeks after the assassination, he volunteered for specialist guerrilla training at Fort Bragg.
Almost all of the instruction in the guerrilla warfare school was classified. The most secret was the top secret training on assassinations and terrorism. And at that time, we went to a different building that had a double barbed wire fence around it and guard dogs in it. On the John F. Kennedy situation, that was brought to our attention as a classic example of the way to organize a complete program to eliminate a nation's leader while pointing the finger at a lone assassin. It involved also the cover-up of the assassination itself. We had considerable detail. They had a mock layout of the plaza in that area and showed where the shooters were and where the routes were to the hospital. I don't remember where those were now. They had quite a bit of movie film coverage, it seemed like, you know, thinking back to that time, and some still photos of the grassy knoll and places like that. They told us that Oswald was not involved in the shooting at all. He was the patsy. He was the one that was set up. We did, myself and a friend of mine, form a very distinct impression that the CIA was involved in Kennedy's assassination. During a coffee break, we overheard one of the CIA instructors say to the other, "Things really did go well in Dealey Plaza, didn't it?" Or something to that effect. And that just reinforced or really added to our suspicions, and we really felt before the end of the training was over that one of those instructors may have been involved himself in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I had to do a lot of rethinking, and perhaps it's a way that soldiers of fortune are, I don't know, but I just then convinced myself, as did my friend, that it had to somehow be in the best interest of the United States government that Kennedy was killed. Otherwise, why would our own people have done it? Simple as that.
At Fort Bragg, 15 months after his training, Dan was summoned to meet an official from the CIA, a company man. David Vanek, a fellow officer in assassination training, also attended.
First, the company man took me aside and showed me his badge, his ID card, and he asked me if I would volunteer to kill a man, a United States citizen, a naval officer. Didn't tell me who it was at first. Now, I assumed what he was talking about was killing a man overseas. He asked me at first if I would accept an assignment to kill somebody. He didn't give me the name, but then I asked for the name, assuming it would be, like I said, overseas. And he gave me the name, William Bruce Pitzer. Hard name to forget, really, once you hear it. And so I told him yes. And then he said, we have to, he started to lay out the details of it. And the details included the fact that I would have to get him before he retired. And he retired in a very short period of time, if I remember correctly, and he was stationed at Bethesda Naval Hospital. So I'd have to actually get him here in the United States. So I refused, because that wasn't the way that we were trained that this was going to happen. We were supposed to be used as their assets, the CIA's assets, for use in assassinations overseas. In the United States, the mafia was supposed to supply what resources they need for killing somebody here in the United States. So he then asked David Vanek. He went over to David Vanek and talked to him. Now, I don't know what he talked to David Vanek about. He might ask him the price of ice cream, I don't know. But I never saw David Vanek after that day. Now, that was in August, the first week of August of 1965.
In November 1963, William Bruce Pitzer was head of the audio-visual unit at Bethesda Naval Hospital. A close colleague at the time was a young petty officer, Dennis David.
3 or 4 days after the assassination, I walked in his office and I saw he was working on some film. He had a movie editor, one of those reel-to-reel that runs across the screen, and he showed it to me, and it was a 16mm film of the autopsy. There were also some slides. He had some slides that he had that showed of tissue slides, and also showed some slides of President Kennedy that were taken while he was on the table at the morgue. And you know, we looked at him, kind of horrified, I guess you would say, at the seriousness of the wound. But I remember one of the things that I remembered was that we saw, they had a picture of Kennedy laying on the table, and it was a front profile, if you will, or front view. And the only thing we saw was a little hole about here in the temple, and then another photograph or another slide that Bill had showed a huge gaping hole here in the back. And so Bill and I logically assumed that the wound was a frontal entry wound, as opposed to what the Warren Commission later said being a shot from behind.
Dennis left Bethesda for a new posting, but in November 1966, a colleague gave him some distressing news regarding his old friend Bill Pitzer. He'd been found dead in a pool of blood in his studio at Bethesda. The official verdict was suicide. Lying face down on the floor, a .38 revolver by his side, he had a bullet wound in the right temple.
When the occupational therapist had told me this, I remember I reminded, I said, you know, that doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense, because Bill was left-handed, and, you know, because we used to kid him all the time when playing bridge about being a southpaw, because sometimes he'd deal in reverse. Instead of dealing them in the correct sequence, he'd deal them in the opposite way, and we'd kind of harass him about it.
There are grave doubts about Pitzer's alleged suicide. His left hand had been so mangled, as if tortured, that his wedding ring could not be removed and given to his widow.
Bill had told me shortly before he left Bethesda, which was around the 7th of December of '65, he told me that he was planning on retiring because he had enough time in and he was wanting to get out, and that he also said he had some damn lucrative offers from some TV networks, and other people have asked me why I think he was assassinated, and I think it was because that with him retiring, they, and I don't know who they are, were afraid that he would take these pictures that he and I had seen, this 35mm and the 16mm film, that he would take them, and that if he went to work for a major studio, that they would use them, or he would have them aired, and that would really, you know, blow some people out of the water if that would have transpired. I could be wrong, I could be all wet, but I do know those films exist because I was there, I saw the damn things.
I am absolutely certain that the name that I was given underneath those pine trees in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in the first week of August was William Bruce Pitzer. I put it completely out of my mind from 1965 until 1993. And I was watching a special in November '93 about the assassination of Kennedy. I think it was a special by Jack Anderson. And at the end of that special, on the television, they rolled a list of 42 names of people who had met a violent death that were somehow associated with the assassination or the cover-up or the autopsy or something. And I was sitting there in my living room watching that, and the name William Bruce Pitzer came over the screen. And it made me go right back to that day in August of 1965. That was the William Bruce Pitzer that I was asked to kill, unless there's two William Bruce Pitzers that worked at Bethesda Naval Hospital. That man, the name of the other Green Beret that was approached by the CIA agent in August of 1965 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was David H. Vanek, captain who went through the same training I did, same class I was in, and I have tried, ever since I saw the name William Bruce Pitcher come out on that screen, I've tried to find him. And I've been totally unsuccessful. I sent letters to the special office and the Retired Services Directorate, where they'll take a letter that you send them with a man's name and serial number, and they'll forward it to him. Or if he's deceased, they'll send it back to you. I got no response from them, so I finally sent another follow-up letter and demanded a response, or I threatened to go to Senator D'Amato to help me on the response. And then I did get a response, but the response was that David H. Vanek never existed in the United States Army.
But Dan still has published Army orders proving that Captain David H. Vanek was with him at the Special Warfare Center.
Recognizing just what kind of a person I was, and which I am hopefully no longer, it is not an easy thing to do. It would be easier for me to just melt into the woodwork and let my family, especially my grandchildren, think of me as kind of the friendly old giant that helps them do things and plays with them, rather than what I've done in the past. And I know that when this, if it is made public, the information that I've given will adversely affect my relations with my family. And I just hope and pray that our love survives it. And I hope and pray that it does some good for this nation.
Former FBI agent and professional investigator Bill Turner has been researching the JFK assassination since the weekend it happened. His exhaustive probing has given him exceptional insight into the events and reasons surrounding Kennedy's death.
There was much anger over his failure to provide air cover at the Bay of Pigs. There was much anger when he did not invade Cuba during the missile crisis in October 1962. After the Bay of Pigs, John Kennedy reamed out the CIA for conducting too high a profile, meaning an invasion. And he said he wanted to continue the campaign against Castro, but he wanted it so it was low profile and invisible. And so the Kennedy brothers did develop a secret agenda, and Bobby was a protagonist, in which there would be a series of sabotage raids, there would be continued assassination attempts against Castro, and there would be teams ready to go into Cuba if the time was right for a second invasion. So all of this was low profile but high intensity, and was going on right after the Bay of Pigs, right up until John Kennedy's death.
Building on the foundations laid by Bill Turner, using classified documents newly released under the Kennedy Assassination Records Act, the investigation into the Kennedy brothers' secret agenda against Fidel Castro has been greatly extended. Project Freedom is the name given to that agenda by two Atlantan writers and researchers. Over the last 7 years, Lamar Waldron has built up a formidable database on this secret agenda and its relationship to Kennedy's murder. Together with colleague Tom Hartman, they have gained unique access to individuals closest to these events and have unraveled some of the darkest secrets lying at the heart of the assassination.
The Kennedys were determined to see some sort of action taken on Cuba, one way or the other, before the end of 1963, primarily because they wanted to avoid Cuba becoming a political football during the 1964 campaigns, and those would, of course, be kicking off at the first of the year 1964.
The reason that this came about was the efforts against Castro, of course, started in 1959 under Richard Nixon. Nixon wildly escalated them in 1960 in an attempt to have Castro assassinated prior to the election so that he could defeat Kennedy in the election. He was unsuccessful in that. Kennedy inherited many of these programs, which ultimately led to the Bay of Pigs and the debacle there. There was Project Mongoose, which Bobby, to a large extent, supported, a CIA program. It didn't work. None of these programs worked, and so Bobby, in utter frustration and I think progressively becoming less trustful of the people who had been running these programs up to this point, said, I'm going to create my own program. We are going to run this out of my office, and it's going to be highly secure and highly compartmentalized, as it is to this day.
Project Freedom, again, was Bobby Kennedy's project that he ran only with his most trusted advisors. So you had Bobby at the top, based in Washington, and also based much of the time in Washington, you had his Cuban confidant. That was Bobby's main liaison with the other small handful of exile leaders that he trusted to work on Project Freedom with him. Those leaders would sometimes contact Bobby directly, but most of the time they would go through his Cuban confidant.
So a second invasion of Cuba was being planned, using a force of Cuban exiles. Robert Kennedy's Cuban confidant was the man in charge.
Harry Williams was in the invasion brigade of the Bay of Pigs, and when he was recuperated from Cuba, Bobby Kennedy tapped him to become kind of his golden boy with the exiles. And Harry, I can tell you, he has a tremendous presence, almost a charisma, if you want to call it that. And so I did interview him, and he told me that the action was going to be based out of the Dominican Republic in a place called Monte Cristi. But the character changed when they cooperated or co-opted a high official in Havana, and the opportunity for an assassination of Castro and a coup presented itself. So this developed along the line, and at that point the second invasion became more of a backup type of idea. John Kennedy, in his settlement with Premier Khrushchev, the Soviet Union, the missile crisis in October of 1962, had agreed that there would be no U.S. involvement in any type of adverse actions against Cuba. That was part of the agreement. So this had to be kept from the Soviet Union, it had to be kept from the FBI, it had to be kept from anybody and anybody that didn't have a need to know. Harry was reporting directly to Bobby Kennedy.
The United States in the summer and fall of 1963 had a great need to get more low-level intelligence assets into Cuba. One of the reasons the Bay of Pigs had failed was because we didn't have good intelligence that told us what the reaction of the Cuban people really would be when the invasion happened. Well, Bobby Kennedy was determined not to let that happen again. So there was a general effort throughout the summer and fall of 1963 to get people into Cuba by legitimate means, not by secret boats in the middle of the night, as the CIA was capable of doing, but these would be people who would go in legitimately, would be able to walk the streets, talk to people, because this was very important for Project Freedom. They had to have ways of finding out what the man on the street thought about the coup, if they were going to support the new leaders, and indeed there were many, many mysterious visits by young men in their early 20s to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City trying to get into Cuba for those kinds of activities.
Oswald supposedly returned from a trip to Mexico City, a very enigmatic trip, in which he made loud noises about getting a visa to Cuba at both the Soviet and the Cuban embassies there, and created quite a ruckus when he was turned down. This again established his bona fides as a Castro partisan. And I'm sure if it was actually Oswald, because there's a lot of evidence that it was not he, but a double that showed up down there. In any event, his bona fides as a Castro revolutionary were established. And upon his return to Dallas, he was in essentially the same role that he had been in New Orleans, being dangled in this ongoing intelligence operation. And the final denouement, of course, was that this intelligence operation in which he was being controlled simply set him up to take the tumble for the presidential assassination. They controlled him, and that's where he wound up, in the Dallas School Book building. And he was simply, like he said in his own words, the patsy.
Tom and Lamar's detailed study of recently declassified documents has revealed a secret plan, part of Project Freedom, that was hijacked by Kennedy's killers, enabling them to escape detection.
Beginning in September of 1963, several agencies of the U.S. government, at Bobby Kennedy's direction, began making contingency plans regarding Project Freedom. They were worried about what would happen if Castro found out about the plan and retaliated in some way.
And so Bobby was faced with a serious problem here. He had a plan that had a very good chance of actually unseating Castro. What if Castro found out about it? And what if Castro found out about it before it happened and launched a preemptive attack of some sort against the United States? Not a military attack, but some sort of a hit-and-run thing. What if he were, for example, to assassinate the U.S. ambassador to Panama or to Guatemala or something like this? And so Bobby had his advisors put together a series of contingency plans around this Cuban operation, these Cuba contingency plans by the State Department, the FBI, the CIA, the Defense Department, people involved in them like Alexander Haig and Joseph Califano, who put together this program that this is how we're going to respond if Castro does something against us, if he kills one of our people. And we want to very carefully control the release of information about the evidence. We want to control the evidence in a way that we can prevent inflammatory information from getting out that would cause the press to go nuts, that would cause the Republicans to use this as a political tool, that would cause Americans to demand an immediate invasion of Cuba that could lead to World War III. They had to have control of the information.
There were very low-level operatives and informants working for the CIA whose primary allegiance was to the mafia. And these people had been working with the mafia for much longer than they had been working with the CIA, and the mafia paid them many, many times what the CIA did. Those people not only told the mafia bosses like Trafficante and Marcello about Project Freedom, but they worked with the mafia in ways to use those plans to kill President Kennedy and use the secrecy surrounding Project Freedom to cover up the mafia's role in it.
Dangling Oswald, the forces involved, I'm firmly convinced, were the same ones that were involved in the ongoing attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. And I'm talking about the combination or the alliance between the CIA and the mafia to snuff Castro. And I think that what happened at Dallas was simply that having the personnel and teams assembled for assassination, having the wherewithal to do it, having the intelligence connections to cover it up, that they simply turned their guns on Kennedy, and that's where it all came from, out of that whole collaboration between the mob and the CIA and some of the Cuban exiles. And I probably should add rogue elements of the CIA, because I know that the director himself, who was a Kennedy appointee, certainly was not involved.
One of the more startling bits of evidence that Oswald was either a member of Project Freedom, part of the program, or that he had been manipulated in such a way that Bobby Kennedy was certain that he was, is found in an article written by a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who was in Washington, D.C. with one of the leaders of Project Freedom just hours after the assassination. And he received a telephone call from Bobby Kennedy just a few hours after Jack was killed, and Bobby's comment to him was, one of your guys did it. One of your guys just killed my brother. And this clearly demonstrates that Bobby's first response was that he recognized either Oswald's name or Oswald's position, and that he believed that Project Freedom had been breached. And this also shows us how and why the Cuba contingency plans were immediately invoked, why the government would go to the lengths that it went to violate state and federal law to seize John Kennedy's body from Dallas, take it to a federal facility in Bethesda, and on, all the other things. All of a sudden, it all makes sense.
We know from sources who were actually working on Project Freedom that Robert Kennedy directed, through intermediaries, certain activities at the autopsy to make sure that national security considerations were observed with respect to the autopsy. And these considerations extended even after the autopsy was finished.
Immediately after the autopsy, the body was then delivered into the care of then Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Haig, later Secretary of State Alexander Haig. And Haig, of course, was one of the authors of one of the Cuba contingency plans. It's very clear from all the conversations we've had with the people who were close to Bobby at that time that he believed, at least in those early days, possibly weeks, that his program that he was responsible for, that he was running, had somehow been turned around or compromised, and used to murder his brother, that he bore some personal level of responsibility for the death of his brother.
I am very convinced that the assassination of John F. Kennedy came from the collaboration between the CIA and the Mafia in attempting to assassinate Fidel Castro. And I feel very strongly that that apparatus that was set up to assassinate Castro simply was turned on Kennedy when the motive piled upon motive to get rid of him. If the truth came out today about what really happened, it certainly would be a major embarrassment to a number of political and media figures. And I find that to be a very healthy thing. I think that people in this country should know how the government is able to cover up things that went on, not always by people being guiltily involved, but by just going along